Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Winner of the prestigious Penn Faulkner Award, T.C. Boyle has long been one of the most poignant pens writing on the page at any generation, blending humor with brilliant observational narratives about the world around us, captured in World's End, The Road to Wellville, The Tortilla Curtain, and his latest Talk to Me. He joins us for a rare career-spanning interview. Professor Boyle, thank you so much for taking out time to be with us. Going back 30 plus years, we read your books in our house growing up. What kind of books were you surrounded by as a child?
I should say I come from a working class family. I'm the first in my family ever go to college. My father was a school bus driver and janitor, raised to only educated to the eighth grade, and raised partly in an orphanage. And my mother, grew up during the Depression with no father in the household. She finished high school as salutatorian, but of course, there was no way to go to college. So I'm the first. So we didn't have a lot of books around. However, our neighborhood school, Toddville School in Crampons, New York, near Peekskill, had a little library, and it was just across the street. And so you could just walk over there and browse the shelves and get books as you liked, which I did do. And my mother, of course, she's the one who taught me how to read, and she read to me. And so one of the things I most enjoy doing in my position today is to go before live audiences and perform a story for them. It takes us all back to that first voice that first read us stories. And in my case, it was my mother.
It's such a wonderful way that so many children discover stories, first hearing them being told through their parents or grandparents. What else excited you as a kid when it came to reading? Was it comic books, books?
The books that I began to get from that little library across the street, uh, early on, I suppose, 9, 10 years old, I don't know, were mainly books about animals that featured animals. I remember there was one about a key deer from the Key Islands off of Florida. And they're a dwarf species of deer and so on. And it had its trials and travails and so on and swam from island to island. I don't really remember, but that sort of thing. And then, of course, a little later on, Albert Pace and Terhune and Big Red and all of those things. And, working up to Jack London and beyond. Uh, Animal stories got me at first. And of course, comic books. I was very much into comic books. They helped me to learn how to read. And also, I'm a baseball fanatic. And so I would read the New York Daily News, which is what we got in our household. And I would read the sports pages. And that not only helped me read about the Yankees, but it also helped with my math because I figured out the batting averages and the ERA of the pitchers. So hallelujah.
When did you first begin to discover you had a way with words as a storyteller?
Uh, I was just a regular neighborhood kid. I played ball with all the other kids and wandered the woods, big woods out there that I wandered all the time. Hmm. uh, I also had time. I've always been someone who can entertain himself. And so I would play with little men, and I would invent stories for them, of course, as you're playing along and talk to myself. And by the way, I still do the same thing, talk to myself and invent stories. Didn't I guess late in high school, um, I was a pretty poor student across the board because I was too young and too immature to really care much about it. But I was good in math. I'm sorry, math. Math was my nemesis. I was good in English and history, and I think it was because I had an ability to write at a higher level than maybe some of the other kids, and that's where my first writings would have been just papers for class.
You went on to be a mentor to so many young minds, but going back to your own time as a student at the University of Iowa, and specifically the writer workshop, who were some of the minds that really were exciting you back then?
I have had great mentors from my earliest years, academic figures who were fathers to me all along the way. So from eighth grade, there was Walter Greenstein, our history teacher, who, seemed pretty old to us, but must have been like 25 or something. Uh, in my undergraduate, I had three great mentors. One who was chair of the English department, Kelsey Harder. Another who was a history professor, and another, uh, Krishnavad, who was a novelist. Then in grad school, I found many mentors, including Miriam Gilbert, who was the Shakespeare expert at Iowa, Frederick P.W. McDowell, who was the chair of my PhD committee and got me hooked on 19th century British literature. And in the writer's workshop, I had Vance Borgelli the first year, the first full year, and he just was amazing. He not in the way of, correct this or do this or go there. He just gave me what I needed. Hey, kid, you're on the right track. And so too with John Cheever and John Irving, who were my three teachers there. They were all just supportive. It was never any line to line discussion of stories. I hardly did any stories at that point, but they just basically said, yeah, you're doing fine. Go for it.
Those are such important words for any aspiring author to hear early in their career. As you began putting your own words in print, short stories were a real vehicle for you to start getting your name around with an audience, whether it was in magazines or periodicals. Tell us why you've been so happy writing in that medium throughout your career, along with novels.
From the beginning, I've been equally interested in the short story and the novel. Most writers of my generation, and I think even the new generations, they feel that stories are a sort of apprenticeship. They graduate to novels. Uh, Novels make you more money, and that's what people want more than short stories. I don't care about that. So I've worked equally in the short story and the novel all throughout my life. And my first book is called Descent of Man, and it is a collection of stories. I wrote those stories while a grad student at Iowa. I didn't begin the novel until I finished my PhD exams.
How long did you work on your first novel, Water Music, till you felt confident you were ready to start shopping it around to agents and hopefully publishers?
First novel was a struggle. It took me 3 years. I had sold maybe 30 stories while I was a student. And so I had connections with the magazines. George Plimpton was a mentor of mine and took me on early. Gordon Lish published one of my stories in Esquire right out. I had a couple in Harper's. So I was established at that point. But then I wrote a novel, and you can't sell a novel without an agent. And Robert Coover, who is also a mentor of mine and one of my all time heroes, introduced me to his agent, Georges Borchardt, who has been my agent ever since. Georges has been my agent from the beginning, and he still is. And I love him dearly. At my son's wedding a few years ago, greeting all these guests and so on, and Georges and his wife Anne were there. And I was feeling very emotional. And I said, Georges, you're the closest thing I have to a father on this earth. And Georges, politely nodded. And then I was talking with some other people, and a few minutes later, he sent Anne over, his wife. And Anne said, well, Tom, Georges has reconsidered. He'd rather be your big brother. This is Georges. He is so hilarious. He's so great.
As
I
an
think there was a thing in Poets and Writers about him some years ago. He's an agent, so he doesn't want the limelight, but he's so brilliant. And finally, he did this long, long Q&A with them, 100 questions, whatever it is. And in one of them, they had canvassed some of his authors, and they asked me, what do you think of Georges Borchardt? And I said, Georges Borchardt is simply the most brilliant and greatest human being ever born in the history of our species. So they presented this comment and said, T.C. Wells said this about you. And George said, well, you know how Tom likes to exaggerate. Then he paused and said, but he's often right. So, I mean, wow, he is so funny and so great. And, he also has represented so many great authors whom I love and admire. And we've just had a great working relationship throughout our lives together. It's been since I was a grad student. When anybody calls me on the phone, I don't want to talk to them, no matter who it is. And I always tell my wife, somebody calls up and they want me, tell them the funeral's on Wednesday. But when George calls, then I want to talk because it's always good news. He doesn't call with bad news.
Wow, that's a lot of history, especially for this business. How did it feel when your agent called and told you those first printed copies of that book were on the way to you? And does that ever get old for you?
It feels good and you never get tired of it.
Yeah.
This, I just got a box of these the other day. This is the Arc for Talk to Me, which is coming out in the fall. It wasn't so much the first book. Of course, that always, excuse me, that always feels great. But what I remember most of all is my first published story, which was in the North American Review. And it came out in my first semester at Iowa. And I remember I kept looking in the magazine room in the library, hoping, I would find it there. I knew it was going to come out, my first story. And there it was. Wow. And I sat there in the midst of all the magazines, feeling very proud and joyful and read through it. And I remember walking up that big hill in Iowa from the library, on my way to the bar, of course, feeling, wow, this is great. And I got $25 for it, which could buy a ton of beer in Iowa City back in those days.
I
So
bet.
that felt pretty good. Again, to be more serious, getting published ratifies you. The editor of the magazine wants the magazine to be the best magazine it can be and is looking for stories and poems and essays that will make it that. And that he or she should select you is a ratification that what you're doing is good and it makes you want to continue doing it. And I would advise if people who want more knowledge on this from me to go to my website, tcboyle.com, and read two pieces. One, This Monkey, My Back, the essay about just this, in which I compare creating art, in this case, fiction, to a kind of drug habit. It's just like that. When you get to the moment of revelation at the end and you see it come together, it is ecstasy and you want to do it again. It's like a drug high. You just shot heroin and here you are. But also, as with heroin, the next day you crash and you have to do it again because you have a habit and again and again. And also, uh, readers might want to look at the forward to T.C. Boyle Stories 2, my second volume of the collected stories, in which I talk about some of my career and what it's like and what it means and why I do what I'm doing.
It really is that addictive, I agree. When you turn to short stories, which throughout your career are prolific in collections like Descent of Man, Greasy Lake, and other stories, it also opened a new door for you to become a live performer. What's brought you the greatest joy about that aspect of your career?
I do love to perform on stage, and I am not going to press you with my deepest thoughts and deepest passages necessarily. I'm going to give you stories that I know will work out loud in that format and engage an audience and really get to them. And so some stories I know very well because I perform them often, like The Lie, for instance, or Chicxulub. These are stories that I love to perform because I know that what effect it's going to have on the audience. And it is a performance. If people want to read it themselves, great. If they want to absorb, a 450-page novel like Water Music, well, they can absorb that.
It would seem like short stories also offer authors a great opportunity to do character development practice. Say, even coming up on novels like your second, Budding Prospect, where we had a marijuana grower, Felix Nesmith. What a great one. Would you talk about him a little bit?
So, in the beginning, if you look at the stories in Descent of Man, for instance, and even to an extent in Greasy Lake, I was much more interested in design, idea, language than in character. The characters were just incidental to all of this. I think as I matured as a writer, I began to be able to do more with character, especially as I began to write novels. So the characters just happen in the way that the story just happens. I don't know how that is exactly. I might jot some notes. I might do research, for instance, in a book like Water Music or like Talk to Me, which is coming out. It's set there in the 70s, and it's about the experiments in trying to teach apes our language. So, of course, I have to do research for 3 months or 4 months or whatever, and I have to go and see some things. But at some point, I remember what Ed Doctorow said once when I was doing a reading with him, and people asked about this, and it was, you have to realize you're not an historian. You are reading the history for a purpose, and that purpose is to create a fiction from it. So at a certain point, the research is over, and a voice begins to talk to you, and you follow it. And that voice will shape the characters, and in an unconscious way, will find the architecture of the book, and so on and so on. Now, that's if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, my advice has always been, I keep right over here a loaded 357 Magnum pistol on my desk, and that's for when it doesn't work.
I'm trying not to laugh in case you're being literal.
Actually, it's in the drawer.
Do book titles tend to rush in your head right at the beginning of writing, or do they tend to more come slowly toward the end?
At the beginning, it's very rare. Budding Prospects is an exception. That I didn't have a good title and had to write down about 50 of them and run them over and over. But 98% of everything I've written, all the stories, all the novels, begin with the title, and with the novels, often an epigraph too, and maybe a kind of structural idea of how many parts it would be. An example, for instance, early on when I didn't really have as much grounding as I do now, would be Budding Prospects. Well, the story is true. My friends were participated in this, so it was a story given to me, and I was able to visit them while they were growing their marijuana and so on. But it made sense to have 4 seasons, 4 parts, 4 seasons. So that kind of thing, a structural idea, a title, an epigraph for thematic value, really does help me when I'm beginning these projects. These questions, which are pretty wonderful, and I think can be revelatory for other writers or beginning writers listening to us, really don't have any definitive answers. It just happens. I mean, I know that's frustrating for people to hear, but it just happens.
When did the now epic idea for one of your most celebrated early works, World's End, which is set against the Hudson Valley's 300-year history, first occur to you as a great idea for a book? This has been really cathartic, too, to go back down some of the personal memory lanes you went in researching it.
I had no idea what the book would be, or I just had an idea that I would like to go back to my home turf, which I had turned my back on, and learn about the history. I was too much of a punk when I lived there as a kid to pay any attention to anything. And so I rented a house one summer. I think it was, I had already been at USC a couple of years, and I went back to New York in my boyhood turf and rented a house and lived there, and wrote stories, but it was also doing research locally. And that began to build up into something. And then we have this free form novel resulting from it, which has an intricate pattern and deals with the history of Dutch times right up until the foment of the late 60s.
For fans, was Walter Van Brunt based on any character locally so colorful he had to make it in the book?
Well, I would point you to Washington Irving, who had a great influence on this novel. He is one of my heroes because he has written 2 of the most indelible stories in the history of storytelling. So, yeah, Van Brunt comes from him.
You followed this masterpiece up with another one, this time starring sailor Hiro Tanaka in East is East. Was this story based on any real life muse?
I had become quite fascinated with Japanese culture, as many Americans had become in the 1980s, because Japan was becoming a power, and their culture was new to us, and we were getting sushi bars, and what is this all about? So yes, I was very fascinated with it, and of course, I'd been reading Mishima and other great Japanese writers, and seeing Japanese movies by great directors and so on. There was a story of a Japanese sailor jumping ship and swimming to shore and being at large. I think it was in Louisiana. And so I took that story and transposed it to Georgia, which is a more familiar place to me. And I had always wanted to go to the Okefenokee Swamp. In fact, I want to go back. And this gave me an opportunity to see that and absorb some of that material. And again, it's a man in nature kind of book, as well as a satire about the writer's colony and all the other stuff going on in that book, and this clash of cultures as well, and cultural differences and misunderstandings. Another theme that goes throughout my work. You mentioned World's End earlier. It's part of that. The whole idea of racism and its deep roots in America. That's one of my early themes I've been writing about for a long, long while, and in many of the stories as well.
I imagine you enjoy the concert of voices that are at play when you're writing an ensemble like the legendary Road to Wellville. So many characters to have fun with there on the page. You got Will and Eleanor Lightbody, Homer Pretz, Dr. Spitzgovel, Dr. Kellogg, Bender and Will. So many. Who were your favorites?
Well, in the case of Wellville and other historical novels, like the aforementioned, Outside Looking In, or Women about Frank Lloyd Wright, there are several of them. Inner Circle about Kinsey. I I get become fascinated by these historical figures. In this case, I call the four of them my great egomaniacs of the 20th century. And I want to see what the effect of these gurus is on their blind followers, because I'm not a blind follower of anybody. And if I'm a guru, I'm a good guru. I don't want you to do anything except enjoy, enjoy literature. I don't want you to buy anything. I don't want you to join my church. I don't want you to be a disciple. So that interests me a great deal. And those books come very closely from the research, because the history I discover is so hilarious and fascinating. The Kellogg story, for instance, all of that stuff is real, really happened. Even the Hundebung technique, all of that is real stuff of crackpot health food, feel good movements, and it continues to this day. So the characters suggest themselves from history, but of course, then you invent the characters. I invented the light bodies and Charlie Ossining and all the rest. But central to it is the figure of Dr. Kellogg, who I make fun of, but um, uh, did some great, you know, you're having heart attacks, you're stressed, your stomach is turned to acid. Well, stop drinking, stop smoking, exercise, eat a vegetarian diet, and so on. He was just, though, a tyrant and a fanatic. And of course, that makes for great comedy.
Did you actually make the journey up to the town the book set in as you were researching and writing it?
I went to Battle Creek and I had a great time. I went and did research there, and I visited uh, the buildings that were extant and all of that. Um, it was a great experience. I got there, by the way, on the heels of a tour I had just done for the previous book. And I went to the library there, trying to be incognito. And I asked my wife to go up to the desk and ask the librarians for certain texts. And they just burst into laughter and pointed at me. And the half door that goes into the library desk had a picture of me with the article from a newspaper that had written that I had said I was going to write about Kellogg next. So it was great. They were ready for me, and they were very helpful, and it was all good.
As their creator, it must have been entertaining to see such a wild cast of characters playing these guys on screen. Whether Matthew Broderick, Anthony Hopkins, John Cusack, Dana Carvey, Laura Flynn Boyle.
Yes, of course. And so also to hear an actor read your story aloud on stage is also the same kind of thrill. Yeah, it was a thrill. It was great. And I loved Alan Parker's movie. I know a lot of people didn't, but I thought it captured the zany spirit of the book. And it was like a kind of like a Fellini film. Um, I loved what Alan did. I had nothing to do with the film. I've never had anything to do with any films. I love films, but my job, I think, is to be my own soul and do my own thing and explore the world in my own way. Um, that said, I hope that many more great movies will be made of my work. Many, many, many have, mostly short films. That's the only major Hollywood feature thus far. Although there are many in the works. Whether they will come to fruition or not, I can't say. I have two close friends who have had enormous success in the film industry, uh, and for all their success, though, several projects they've done and spent a year or two on never came to fruition. But every project that I've ever started has always come to fruition. I could take you down, Jake. Come on down to the living room and see the bookshelf. They're there, you know. Uh, so no matter what the financial inducement, I wouldn't want to be part of anybody else's project or to put my heart and soul into something that would never come to fruition and also isn't perfect. So I'll tell you a story about that.
Please.
When I first came to LA, I had a film agent, Everett Ziegler Jr., Ziggy, the grand old man of Hollywood, who had his own table in the Polo Lounge for 50 years. Ziggy was great. And he had a very hoarse voice and he was very excitable. And he called me up a lot and I went to lunch with him a few times and he had various deals. It's always got some deal going with somebody and so on. But they all wanted me to participate and to write. And I kept refusing and refusing until finally I said, Ziggy called me up. He said, Jesus, Tom, so-and-so, it's so-and-so. I said, okay, Zig, you win. I'll do it. But on these conditions, I've got to write the screenplay, direct the film, and play all the principal female roles in drag. Those are my conditions. And nobody ever made it. However, it's been almost consistently under option since it came out. And for the last 7 or 8 years ago, Robert Marciniak is trying to do it in Germany. He told me that new green screen technology really will help to cut costs as opposed to on location in Africa. So I hope for that, and many other projects are going forward. Tortilla Curtain, of course, the pandemic kind of hurt everybody in Hollywood. But Tortilla Curtain is in its third deal, and this is for a series, a TV series. Okay, great. I don't know. I don't have control over it, but my hope, of course, is that it will be made and made well and attract more people to the books. A movie is sort of an advertisement for the book.
You took some truly deep dives into the subculture with both the Terranauts and Drop City, which are set completely off the grid. The latter novel has a memorable hippie commune. Was that important to you to have these kinds of settings that are totally different from book to book?
It's all one. It's all just a dream, and some dreams are more vivid than others, and some parts of a dream are more vivid than others. I don't know. It just happens. Of course, I wanted to take my hippies to Alaska because this is a book about withdrawing from the rat wheel of capitalism and the infinite production of product, which is destroying the world. I just wanted to go back in time. The hippies, let's drop out. Let's live more simply. Is that possible? And of course, at that time, the final frontier, and I was inspired by McPhee in this, by the way, coming into the country, was Alaska. And I'd always wanted to go there, and this gave me an excuse to go and spend a month touring around and looking at things. Um, the other result, of course, is that we can't withdraw to a simpler life because there are too many of us and there are too few things to eat, as we're going to find out very soon. The vast reduction throughout the world of flying insects is pretty damn worrisome. You want to talk the bottom of the food chain and what we're going to be eating in 50 years. Well, Cormac McCarthy got that right.
The worldwide best-selling Tortilla Curtain really opened a lot of readers' eyes for the first time to the issue of illegal migration through a different perspective. And it's interesting because you tell it from two. One is Candido in America, and the other is Delaney and Kira. Was that based on your own experience living in Los Angeles at that time?
I couldn't have written the book, I don't think, if I hadn't grown up in New York. I grew up in New York. I had never been west of the Hudson until I was 21, and that was only to go to New Jersey. So I didn't know the West at all when I came here in 1978 to teach at USC. In the 80s and into the 90s, when this book was written, we had large questions that continue to be unanswered about immigration from the South, especially. And I was surprised by the attitude of local native Angelinos, which seemed to be callous and racist. And I just wondered about that. I wondered, how is that? And so I presented a book in which you get 4 points of view from two couples, one a white couple living up in Arroyo Blanco Estates, and one recent immigrants from Mexico who are living because they have no other way of living in the Topanga Canyon itself. And I think rotating between the points of view allows you to have sympathy. So it's my most read book. It's taught in the schools and so on. About which I have mixed feelings. I'm honored, but on the other hand, to have to read a book, to have a book assigned and you must read it. Books and novels are supposed to be subversive. You're supposed to read them because you piss in the face of society. But anyway, um, uh, so many people have said that it changed their point of view, um, which is great. It's just great. It's what fiction can do. It can put you inside somebody else. How can you call one group of people with one brushstroke, or call them a name, or try to generalize about them, or be prejudiced against them if you know them, if you actually know them? And this is one way of knowing them.
You then captured a real life fugitives run from the law and the harder they come. What did you find most compelling about the themes at play in that story to make you want to put it down on paper?
Man against nature, for one thing. The fact that he was able to elude all the SWAT teams and the dogs and everything else is pretty exciting story. And I wanted to reflect on this crazy gun violence thing that is one of America's great sicknesses. Um, Shortly after the book came the shootings in Santa Barbara, and I might have written about that instead. I don't know. I mean, I liked I liked, I was attracted to that story of Bassler because of the wilderness and how he was able to live in it, like his heroes, the frontiersmen. Um, I did come back to the Santa Barbara story in a new story that you can look up online. It was in the New Yorker 2 years ago, and it's the title story of next year's collection. Um, I walk between the raindrops, and it does focus on that. So it's something that will not go away. And I also did an earlier story about American violence in killing babies, violence at the abortion clinics, and that's 20 years ago probably. The end of that story will tear your heart out, boy.
Taking recent releases like San Miguel, A Friend of the Earth, and When the Killing's Done, what's your approach to the delicate territory of trying to bring attention to issues you really care about on the page without turning the reader off in the process?
Well, When the Killing's Done, for those who don't know, is set on the California Channel Islands, primarily on Anacapa, and uh, and the island that lies right across from us. I can look out this window. We're 2 blocks from the ocean. When I moved in here 28 years ago, these trees hadn't grown up, and you could catch a glimpse of the water out there. When you go down to the beach, you can see Santa Cruz. It's right there. It's 28 miles away. Um, and it is a national park, and it is the least visited of our national parks for the simple reason that you have to vomit over the side of a boat for an hour and a half just to get there. Anyway, uh, the story that I told is a true story of removal of invasive species. And the thing you say, am I proud of? I am proud of this fact that when I did the tour for the book, a portion every night, no matter where I went, of the audience was made up of field biologists who said this to me in essence. Well, we are lecturing the public about the dangers of climate change, extinction, invasive species, and they don't listen. But they listen to you because you have dramatized it. And I think that's a great thing. I'm not, I don't think fiction should advocate for anything. Fiction is a work of art. It should be a seduction of the reader. But you read my books, you know what I stand for and what I believe in. And so I can at least draw attention to this because I'm interested in it and I'm trying to figure it out myself. We're living in such a grim time, in my lifetime, the population of the earth has tripled. We went from my being a kid in the 50s and 60s of superabundance no limit to anything. The trash just thrown away. That was it, you know. The bottles are thrown in the river. All of that. At least after Earth Day, which we just celebrated here, by the way. This is Santa Barbara, where it all began. Um, uh, um, at least people recycle as a beginning, you know. The prospects look very grim for the future of our species, though, and it's difficult for me to have to deal with this all the time and write stories about it and try to dramatize it. And again, I'm glad that it should influence somebody in some small way, but I'm writing it for my own purposes, for my own self to figure things out. So, for instance, see, just happen to have the Relive box here, the last collection, and in here are two stories about the decline of the environment. And one is very, very comedic. You don't miss your water till the well runs dry about the drought here, which is killing us. And then one that is just sort of an invention about the rising seas, and it's called Surtsey, and it's set on Kivalina Island off of Alaska, which is being slowly inundated, and the community has to be transported away from there. It's just a precursor to what awaits us.
In collections like If Whiskey Were River, T.C. Boyle short stories 1 and 2, Tooth and Claw, The Human Fly, and Wild Child, you've continued to churn out a fountain of short stories over the last 40 years. I imagine that's a welcome break from these full-length novels that get so involved.
Some stories, it seems to me, need to be told in short form and others in long form. I will say this: I never do two things at once. I see one thing through to the end and then move on to the next. And if you'll notice, pretty much throughout my career, I have two novels and then a book of stories, two novels and a book of stories. And that is because in between each novel is a period of writing stories, which might last 6 months, 9 months, I don't know. I just got done with that period. During this COVID thing, last January, I finished the new novel, Talk to Me. Then I wrote 7 new stories over the course of the year, one of which you saw in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago, The Shape of a Teardrop.
Do you have any favorite short stories among these collections or favorites that you enjoy performing live from these anthologies?
I don't. I regard them all equally. Uh, I, these are my stories. Here they are. Uh, uh, so with this one that's coming out next year, that will give me two more collections. And the first two big collected volumes each contain four uh, collections. So I've got to live for a few more years to get volume three, because I still have to do two more collections after that. So there's always a goal. There's always something to keep you going.
Outside of on the live stage, do you tend to reread any of your works after you're done writing them?
I don't. They sit there unless something should come up. When they were making this pilot for budding prospects, I had nothing to do with it, but I loved the result. I reread the book just for the first time in all those years, just to see where it was going. In the event that it did go to a series, they would consult me certainly. And one thing I'm very good at, and I have with many directors and people making films of my work, I'm perfectly willing to talk with them face to face or on the phone, because structurally I can give them immediately, right off the top of my head, I can give them many possible avenues into how to do this.
What about reading reviews of your work, whether it's from the live stage or from new work on the page?
Uh, I would be honored if someone would write a rigorous look at the work and its themes. I mean, it screams out. I don't know if people are doing theses on it, but boy, there are a million theses there. The connections in these 30 books. The 30th comes out next year, by the way. I think would prove very rich for someone to enjoy and write about. Sure. But
Um,
as far as that's concerned, I mean, I didn't know this guy. I didn't know he was writing a book. I don't know anything about it. It seems to me flat out wrong in many ways, just as reviews are often very wrong, even if they love what you're doing. Sometimes it baffles you. By the way, which is why, for all the authors out there, you never explain anything. The book is the explanation, period. Uh, whether right or wrong in your mind, it's not for you to say. You might be wrong yourself, and there may be other avenues of interpretation that the book gives that you're not aware of or that you don't give primacy to.
You've been a distinguished English professor at the University of Southern California for the better part of 4 decades. We've actually had a couple of your students on the show. What have you most enjoyed about inspiring new generations of minds in the classroom as a teacher?
I do miss the brilliance of the students. The pool of talent is extraordinary. I'm just a coach and a mentor, and of course, the guy who tells all the jokes. So we had a great relationship over the years. I was deeply involved in teaching. Again, if the university were in Santa Barbara, maybe I'd still be doing it. But finally, after my road warrior phase, I got tired of that, and the car hardly even leaves the garage anymore. Whereas it was a weapon of destruction, boy. Oh my God. Getting down that coast highway and fighting those drivers off. Wow. Yeah. So uh, I think one of my roles, like we talked earlier about how I'd been mentored and how much I loved my teachers and became a teacher myself, is to keep alive the love of this art form that you and I love so much, and to remind people that it is an entertainment and not an academic exercise, that we read stories for joy and for subversion, and because we love them, and because we want to get out of our minds, of course. And so to help coach all of these eager writers that I've had over the years is a pure joy.
Among the treasure chest of gems you've imparted over the years, any you share here with the viewers that might be aspiring authors just now discovering your work?
Um, I listened when I was young to the old writers who would always come through Iowa City. I mean, all the famous writers, Vonnegut and Styron and people like that.
Wow.
And essentially, they would say this, that what you're writing for is for the work itself. You're not writing for glory or for money or to have sexual liaison with the other opposite sex or the same sex for that matter. What you're doing is you're writing for the work itself. And I privately thought, well, what bullshit. I'm writing to conquer my enemies and destroy the world. That's what I'm writing for. But of course, they were right. It gives you a foundation for your life. And for me, it gives me a way of thinking deeply about this madness of our species and our existence in an unfathomable planet, and especially one as we live in this generation that seems to be collapsing around us because of the depredations of human beings. Which is why, if I look back, I see that my main themes have been our relationship to the environment and our being as another animal on this planet and what that means in a universe absent of God or purpose. So this is what I'm writing about, and to keep exploring these themes in various ways. And I've just showed you the latest way of getting into that. What is it to be human? What is language? What is identity? All of these things. So that is a way of giving me satisfaction, and it gives me something to do all day long.
Whether talking to fans after a live show or at a book signing or at a guest lecture, what have you most enjoyed about inspiring young minds over all these years?
I no longer go down and teach my class at USC. I'm in Santa Barbara. It's a 2.5 hour drive in traffic, maybe two if it's good. So I stopped doing that 6 years ago. It was only my hobby anyway. I only did it for 37 years. That I inspire anybody in any way is thrilling. I mean, an artist is a showboat to a degree, and we talked about the older writers saying you write for the writing itself, etc. But of course, if there's no audience, it would be very difficult to write anything or perform anything because we want the satisfaction of presenting it to someone else because we've discovered something, we love something, we've created something, and we want people to be affected by it.
I bet you've missed the road. With COVID winding down, what can fans expect when they come out to see a new TC Boyle show? What are they going to get for their money?
I'm going to give you a show. And the thing I like best about it is go to university, for instance, and maybe some of the students are fans and they might bring a boyfriend or a girlfriend who's in a different field and doesn't know literature except as a pain in the ass you have to write a paper on. and I want to blow them away. I want to remind them of what a story is and just give them the story. I don't need to have charts. I don't need surprises. I just need a microphone and a darkened theater. Probably one of the high points for me in all these thousands of appearances I've done. The story Chicxulub, which we mentioned earlier, it's a very grueling, horrifying, tragic story. Um, an I narrative, a father's daughter, they get a phone call, she's been hit by a car and she's in the hospital. Um, I've read this to audiences as big as maybe 1,500 or more in a theater. There's a theater in San Francisco for arts and lectures. And here I am in this perfect auditorium stage, complete darkness, and I'm laying this story on them as an actor. And there's a point in that story, you probably know what it is, where it's so horrifying. Nobody moves. You know, you go to the opera, you go to a concert, you go to a lecture, whatever it is. People sneeze, they shuffle their chairs, getting up and down. No one moves. There's not a sound of any kind. And I know I've got them. I've really got them. And so I feel what an actor must feel in a glorious moment of performance when you know you have everybody with the power of a story. That's what I live for, the power of the story. And this is just another way of delivering it. Now, of course, many writers are not extroverts. They don't want to be on stage. Happily, I do. So it's a nice little adjunct. And by the way, I also do all the books of stories for books on tape as well, you know, the audio versions. I enjoy doing that. I don't do the novels anymore because it takes too much time in the studio and it is absolutely grueling. Yeah. Yeah. I'm really itching to get out before a live audience, of course, but uh, some actors were reading my stories for a program, and it was really quite amazing. Bill Pullman, for instance, who's done it with me before, his face is huge. It's right there. It's so incredibly intimate. You know, it can work.
What about once you're off stage and back in the writing room? What gives you the greatest thrill when a new idea starts flowing out of your head these days?
You know, I sound sort of like a saint here, and I am. I am a saint, of course, but this is not my motivation. My motivation is to figure out for myself how I feel about things. And um, for better or worse, my brain works in terms of storytelling. That's what I do. I don't know why that is. It's a gift. It came to me. I found it. I was lucky. And I pursue it every single day of my life because this monkey, my back, there's no end to the joy. And I should say, too, and I think many people know this, yes, I have a PhD. Yes, I taught at the university all these years. I never had an interest in being a public intellectual, in giving lectures or writing essays. I'm just an artist and I'm fascinated by the fiction. I don't know what it will be ever. There's no outline. It just happens. And it's a kind of miracle each time out. It's also a struggle. As you know, I mean, you tear your brain out. You're miserable. I was very miserable today, for instance, about what I'm working on. But it's a kind of magic. When it comes together and starts to happen, it's magic. It's a way of getting out of the world, and we need to get out of the world. So, I don't know. Oh, here's another one. Okay, look. Here's the last novel. That's about human consciousness and trying to change human consciousness with LSD. So, the early days of Timothy Leary. So, now we have Talk to Me, which is about animal consciousness. It seems that consciousness is a burden to our species. And that's why we are all drug addicts and alcoholics, because we need to change the switch, turn that switch somehow. And I think art, of course, is what does this for us most immediately and best of all. A lot of times you're not on, no matter what you try, you're not on. And if you're lucky, you forget that you're writing and you're on.
Mr. Boyle, for the generations of fans that you've influenced with 30 books and counting, we thank you so much for being on About the Authors TV.
Well, thank you, Jake. This is my life. I'm glad to be here with you.